Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute Next Round podcast. I'm Tim Anaya, PRI's Vice President, Marketing and Communications. And as always, I'm joined by our friend, PRI's Communications Director, Matt Fleming. Matt, how are you today?
I'm good, Tim. How are you?
Well, we're both better than the disgraced, soon-to-be ex-Congressman Eric Swalwell, whose escapades will dominate our discussion today. If you were tuning in hoping to hear about what's going on in Iran, or the president going off on Pope Leo, or a discussion of Homeland Security funding, or some other legislation in Sacramento, we're going to disappoint you this week. But I think there's a lot of angles of the Swalwell scandal and resignation that we're going to go through today from our perspectives, having worked at the Capitol, having worked at the highest level of press and communications. And I think our hope today with our discussion is we want to kind of take you behind the scenes. You know, we've seen up close and in person a lot of scandals like this in our own way, not certainly at the level of the Swalwell scandal. But, you know, I think a lot of people are wondering, why is it this way? How does it get to be this way? Why do people respond the way that they do? And so we hope to take you into the room where it happens and explain kind of why things are happening the way they are. And I think to start with, the scandal itself, you know, Matt, we've certainly had a front row seat over the years working in government, working at the Capitol. There's a lot of people that do bad things in politics. There's a lot of rumors of things that are going on in politics. We saw it every day working at the state capitol. There are a lot of things, a lot of people who you think are one way but aren't so good in how they actually operate. But yet it's a rumor that a lot of people know about, but you never hear about it in a newspaper. It never becomes into popular opinion. And, you know, this Swalwell thing, I think, is another one of those. And it starts with you had Sacramento insiders that were so desperate to anoint someone in the governor's race that they were willing to put their faith in an image of kind of a nice, fair-haired young man who was a fighter of Trump and, you know, wouldn't really rock the boat to whatever their interest was. And even though they didn't know him, they'd never met him before, still they endorsed him and still they put him forward as their candidate for governor. It's kind of how things are, but I think that kind of group mentality, you know, the kind of insiders pushing the way forward, I think sadly that's how too much business is done in politics today, even when, yeah, you should do your due diligence. Yeah, you should look people in the eye. You should meet them at least and ask them the questions yourselves. Matt, what's kind of your 30,000-foot view of the scandal, how we got here, and why is our politics like this today?
Look, there's whatever, 8 top Democratic candidates, something like that. And those are the candidates they have, and everyone has to kind of get in line behind someone. And Eric Swalwell is as good as anyone else, I guess, from a Democratic perspective. I would argue that he was grossly unqualified on his merit, but that's a separate issue. Yeah, man, I mean, this is apparently something people have long heard about and rumored that Eric Swalwell was a creep with women, which, as you and I both know, is not terribly uncommon in politics. I think one of the women who just came out today said that he actually raped her, drugged her and raped her.
Allegedly.
Yes, yeah. Well, I mean, it's what she said, but it's allegedly. And that's obviously, when I say like there are creepy guys in politics, I don't know one consciously who I know drugged and raped anyone. So we'll just get that straight. Certainly they might get inappropriate or handsy at a fundraiser or something, but never anybody drugging and raping that I know of. Having said that, if there's not like a victim, there's not really a crime, you know? And I think that in an environment like we have today where everything is negative campaigning, everything is oppositional research, everything is, everyone wants a fighter on both sides. And Eric Swalwell has drawn the ire of Republicans and President Trump. And so I think that when he's introducing himself to possible interest groups like SEIU, California Teachers Association, members of the legislature, you know, if they hear these allegations without really women coming forward and saying anything, I think that someone like Eric Swalwell has the credibility to say, well, that's just a MAGA conspiracy theory, or, you know, something like that. And as you see, like the second a victim actually comes forward, everything changes. But until a victim comes forward, it's sort of like, it is sort of hearsay.
It's a level of degree. I can speak for myself. I'm not going to give you, our listeners, any specifics on the air today, but there's a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of people who do things they shouldn't do in politics at the highest levels. But it's exactly that. It's the degree of it, but it's also who was victimized and how were they victimized? Are they coming forward? Was a resolution made to kind of make them whole and deal with the incident? So I think that there's certainly some of that. I think the other thing that is very interesting is the kind of the groupthink that has gone into this governor's race in particular in California. For whatever reason, and I think we would probably argue that the bad policies from Gavin Newsom's California way, his leadership style, what he's passing off to the next governor as the result of poor policy. Well, why would anybody sign up for that, right? You want to sign up for peace and prosperity. You don't want to sign up for having to solve major problems, deal with a massive budget deficit, etc. There's, 8 to 10 major problems facing whoever the next governor is. And so it's no surprise that if you're Kamala Harris, if you're Alex Padilla, if you're any of the other candidates who looked at and passed on the race, yeah, I don't blame you. But the kind of groupthink of Sacramento is so, I would argue, desperate to stay in power, have a governor who will do their bidding for them, whatever it may be, that you'd get kind of a unknown like Eric Swalwell. And I don't mean he's unknown in terms of nobody knows who he is. He is unknown to the Sacramento world. He literally has never been here. Reportedly, one of the stories I read, he was in Sacramento taking meetings with people in one of the big office buildings that faced the Capitol, and he saw the construction project going on and asked, is that condos they're building next to the Capitol? If you're CTA, if you're CMA, if you're these other groups that want to keep your bread buttered, you get in early for someone like that who he didn't really have a worldview one way or the other on their policy agenda, but you guarantee he'll remember his friends. It's a sad statement on our politics, but I think that's what a lot of this was about at the end of the day. What say you?
I think that's right. I mean, I think at the end of the day, he's the one that people could kind of coalesce around. I think that'll, the benefit of him not being known in Sacramento is that people didn't have a fixed negative opinion, which I think is something that Katie Porter, who also hasn't been around Sacramento, but I do think people have a fixed negative opinion of her. And it's something Tom Steyer and Katie Porter both suffer from. Obviously, either one of those two could be the Democratic candidate, could be the next governor, but Swalwell, I think, was a largely unknown quantity. I think some of the other candidates are better known in Sacramento, like Betty Yee, Antonio Villaraigosa, Becerra, and others. But he's kind of a fresh face. He makes sense in a purely political way, and I think some Democrats were worried that two Republicans might make it through the top two, and they thought that coalescing was better than nothing. His campaign seemed to start gaining steam, and a lot of people just want to get on the winning train. And for me, I think once he got the California Teachers Association, that coupled with being a consistently high poller and having other noteworthy endorsements, I think he really did start to pull away. So I think that it started to look like he was the one who was going to win. So yeah, I think people were just making political calculations, but I don't think there's anyone who could possibly tell me he was the best candidate. Anyone who endorsed him, unless they had like a personal relationship with him and just wanted to back their buddy, no one can tell me he was the best. I mean, Tim, you highlighted it to me offline, looking at his issues page was like, one sentence, we're going to bring back housing, we're going to solve homelessness. It was like very, very devoid of any sort of, policy prescriptions. And, what we did know about him, Tim, and we've talked about this, he is known for not showing up to votes. He voted fewer times than a guy who died last year. He probably didn't live in California, hence that having no idea what's going on at the Capitol. And he had a very paltry record to speak of. And the thing he's best known for being an impeachment lawyer, he was 0-1. He didn't get the impeachment conviction, which some people might think that's a good thing. Some people might think that's a bad thing. Irrelevant of that, he obviously wasn't, the thing he's best known for wasn't even successful. So yeah, no one can convince me that they really thought he was the best person for the job. I think he just made the most political sense.
Now, let's talk about, because we're the communications professionals in the room here, don't try this at home if you're listening, their kind of attempts to dig out of it communications wise. So we saw two things on the day, and it's staggering, from when the story first broke in the San Francisco Chronicle. Our buddy Alexei Koseff, once again, breaking a major story. Alexei now in the Chronicle's Washington bureau, but previously in his past media outlets broke things like the French Laundry story. How the dominoes all fell in really one day. On Friday, you saw two things. You saw Swalwell put out a kind of, I don't know, it looked like a hostage video to me, and he looked terrible. He looked like someone caught in the bad blue shirt. He was allegedly at his friend Stephen Klubeck, the multimillionaire's mansion. It was terrible. He looked like a guy caught cheating on someone trying to explain it away to his girlfriend. And then you had his lawyer went out on the Alex Michelson show on CNN to try to defend him. And boy, he just obviously had never been through media training before. And he was kind of a mix of, we're going to go after victims and we're going to get to the bottom of it and all of these things. And it was kind of communications 101 of what not to do. And Alex, if you watch his questioning of him, he turned prosecutor pretty quickly, and I think spoke for the audience, ask him, do you really expect us, the viewers, to believe the things that you're saying? And I think that certainly the communications angle was a case of stop digging is the first way to get yourself out of the problem. And they certainly were digging further with their kind of bad attempt to deal with this through communications. Matt, what's your take?
I mean, at this point, he almost has to, deny, fight it in the court of public opinion. I agree with you that his lawyer looked ridiculous on CNN with Alex Michelson. Having said that, his lawyer has had a miserable job. And Tim, you and I have both been spokespeople and had to say stuff we don't really want to say. I've never had to obviously defend anything like that, but I certainly have had to make public comments on topics I really wouldn't personally want to talk about. So I think they don't have any other strategy or any other choice they can make besides doing this. Having said that, there is the possibility that he's totally innocent or guilty of being kind of, slimy, but not, a rapist.
Allegedly.
Well, that's what I said. I said it's possible he's not a rapist. So yeah, he looked terrible in the hostage video, but that could be also because he's innocent. Who actually knows? And I'm not sitting here trying to, question the victims or anything like that. All I'm saying is they were innocent until proven guilty. And, he's going to have his day in court. Having said that, it's stacking up against him. It's not looking good. And there is something to be said for the fact that this looks like it was coordinated. A social media influencer was, online saying, oh, this stuff's about to drop, which means she knew about all this stuff that seemingly had nothing to do with her. And then it drops, and then there's more women who come forward. And I get that, like, some women, because I've heard them say this before, like, it's one thing when, he's just some no-name congressman, but now that he might be the governor of California and getting elevated to a higher office, now they feel more compelled to stick their neck out there. And, for victims, this is not an easy thing. People are going to doubt you, and you have to talk about it and relive it, and that's not easy either. And a lot of women would rather forget about it. All that being said, this has to play out, and we have to kind of see what happens, and, we shouldn't rush to judgment. But again, the victim's testimony certainly seems credible. Just from a communication standpoint, it's a tough one to kind of make it through. You have to just kind of say what you're going to say and just leave it at that. The lawyer, just one more thing, forgive me, the lawyer had remarkably short and concise answers, which really to me was telling. Like, he did not want to say too much. And again, that doesn't implicate guilt or innocence, but to me, it was telling that he didn't want to elaborate even a little bit.
We'll get back to Next Round in just a moment, but first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week. Well, it reminds us of back in the day when Al Gore was, what did he say over and over again on repeat? There was no controlling legal authority, no controlling legal authority. There was no controlling legal authority. And this guy kind of did his version of that. And it's his job. He has to be very careful
Yeah.
in what he says. I think says to me, if I were Swalwell, you might want to look into different legal representation watching that performance. And it's increasingly clear with the additional allegations coming out that this may not just be a public relations disaster. This could also be a criminal disaster for him too. And remember, California has some of the most victim-friendly statute of limitation laws when it comes to sexual abuse and sex crimes.
And
So
Tim, you did remind me of something here too, because there's politically guilty and then there is legally guilty. And you and I can't really speculate on whether or not he's legally guilty, right? That's the thing you and I are highly trying to sidestep because we don't know. He is afforded under the U.S. Constitution. It's one of the things that makes this country great. He is innocent until proven guilty, and he is afforded his day in court, as are his accusers are afforded their day in court, right? Where they're allowed to, have their say, and also he's allowed to, have them cross-examined. Setting that aside, in terms of political guilt, I mean, his political career is over. There's really no coming back from this. I can't even imagine, even if he was exonerated, it's really hard for him to even come back from this, and I think that it's fine that there's a higher standard, or for legal than it is for political, because by all accounts, I mean, if there's smoke, there's fire, and I'm sure that he was doing something that may not have been illegal, but certainly unbecoming of someone in his office. Not all of these women, but many of the women who spoke out were staffers of his, and as a member of Congress, or as any boss, really, he needs to promote a safe and welcoming work environment, not a hostile one. And you can do that and still be on the right side of the law. You can still make it a hostile work environment. I guess technically once you make it hostile, but anyway, you know what I mean. You know what I mean.
yeah. And of course, in politics, the standard is the other way. You're guilty until proven innocent.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the media coverage. One of the things, and I saw this a lot online, and I think it's an interesting topic to explore. Sacramento, people may not remember, but Sacramento, the state capital, was where the Me Too movement was born. And there were several largely Democrat state legislators who had to resign during that era for wrongdoing of various sorts, usually in a sexual nature. And, during that time, again, as we mentioned before, capital community, it's kind of like high school, all the rumors about everybody. There were a lot more cases of people doing bad things than made the newspaper. And that, I think, is how it should be, right? That we don't want reporters to be gossip mongers. And there is a standard of sourcing and proof that you have to have before you put these allegations in the LA Times or some story. And I've said many times, and I still believe it, I think our friend Melanie Mason at that time of the LA Times deserved a Pulitzer Prize for her coverage of that, of the Me Too movement, because I know she knew all the rumors that we did as staff and people working in the political world, but she reported what she could prove. And that's, I think, the issue here, right, is that you hear a lot of people saying, in the aftermath of it, right, that unless you have a victim willing to go on the record or something tangible, you have a police report filed or you have video footage of some sort, well, you can't really report that. And I think that it may not bring a bad politician to political or legal justice, but it's probably how we want journalists to operate, with that kind of level of integrity, even if it, may result in a bad guy like Swalwell kind of continuing along with his bad deeds for a period. Matt, you've been a reporter. Been a reporter on Capitol Hill. You've been on both sides of these kind of issues. Take us behind the scenes, kind of how does it work? What are you thinking of? And what's your view of how the media has covered this case in particular?
Yeah, I mean, just outward facing, because I don't know what information anybody might have had, but like we talked about, if you don't have a source, you really don't have a story. I think back to because we just saw something similar with Biden and his mental health, right? And with journalistic integrity, it's hard to say and make a story that Biden is losing his mind, right? Because, yeah, it might be obvious after a bunch of appearances, public appearances, it might appear that way. But, some of that is tied up in a clinical diagnosis, right? Like, what are you going to say? He seemed loopy today. I mean, you could say that, right? That's not necessarily a story, but he's consistently seemed tired. You could sort of say something like that, but also I don't know if that's a story either. He's losing his mind. You could say that, but you kind of need something to back that up. And it is similar to this where it's like, yeah, a lot of people, one staffer says to a reporter, a lot of people says Eric Swalwell is a creep. And it's like, really? That's interesting. Tell me more about that. It's like, well, I don't have anybody specific, but I know that like some of the people, some of his interns have said that. You're like, oh, can you point me to anyone? Well, no, I can't, but that's just what I've heard. And if you're a reporter on the receiving end of that, it might be interesting and you might ask around if you know anyone in his office, but it's kind of hard to run that down. You don't really have a story. And reporters, first off, want to be careful not to unfairly ruin someone's career, but they also don't want to set themselves up for a defamation lawsuit, right? Like you can't go around saying that Eric Swalwell is a rapist without any sort of proof, right? You can't, you're setting yourself up for defamation right there. So they need some kind of proof. And without the proof, there's nothing to say. I'll say that I personally ran into something similar, more similar to the Biden story than the Swalwell story. But when I was covering the Senate for roll call, Mississippi Senator Thad Cochran was losing his mind. And I don't know if it was Alzheimer's or dementia or whatever, but you walk up to him and, if you've ever encountered anyone who has Alzheimer's, dementia, or something like that, Thad Cochran had something like that. And he ended up dying. And I think the story ended up kind of coming out, but it was something literally every person knew. I mean, he was the appropriations chair and you could not ask him questions because he honestly had barely any idea where he was. I was kind of new there and it felt like I'd burn a bridge if I had written that. And also I was sort of speculating, what do I say? He seems like he has no idea where he is at the time. Okay, well, if he's on some medication or I got something wrong, I would have just ruined my career for no real reason, right? And so you start to run into challenges like that where, I say a lot to say like you have to kind of have some sort of proof or documentation. You need a witness. And you could say that in the Thad Cochran story, I was the witness, but what was I witnessing? That he just wasn't acting the way I thought he should have. I mean, if I witnessed a rape or something like that, obviously that's a different story. But, there is just this higher level in reporting and people can say, oh, if this was an open secret, why didn't reporters write about it? It's because they didn't have any sort of documentation or evidence that it was true. Now, some of our listeners, and not to make this long, I'll make this part quick, but some of our listeners might be saying, I read anonymous sources all the time. Yeah, that's true. You might read, Kamala Harris is considering endorsing rent control or something like that. Most times that's coming from her office. So there's a real source saying it, and it might be corroborated, or the source might say like, yeah, you're allowed to say, quote me as a, someone with, someone close to the situation or someone with knowledge of her plans or, a campaign staffer who requested anonymity or something like that. But also like whether or not she's thinking of endorsing rent control is way different than Eric Swalwell did this to this person, So there's a little bit of a fine line, but then look, this might come as a shock to some of our readers and others that might not, but when you see anonymous sources leaking information about internal strife in a political operation or candidates' alleged plans to endorse someone or introduce some sort of piece of legislation, 9 times out of 10, that's coming from the office themselves. And either they're doing like a trial balloon where they just want to see how people react to it, or if it's about internal strife, maybe it's somebody making a move and trying to take out the chief of staff or, something like that. But, there's a lower bar for political gossip than there is for these kinds of things. And I think that's a good thing.
Yes, I think that's right. And, I think the frustration is understandable. The Biden one is a very good example, right? Because we saw with our own eyes how he was. And, we've all had an elderly relative with dementia or kind of on the verge of it, kind of acting and behaving in the same way. But again, without a doctor's report or you examining him yourself or him admitting it, it's just hearsay. If we don't like reporting on rumor in one way, well, you got to have no reporting on rumor in another way too, right? And I think it really does cut both ways. But I think you're going to see my prediction, no shortage of reporting on various allegations and other women and other incidents in the days and weeks ahead.
One thing to add to that too. So now there is a lower bar for reporters to write about allegations because it follows another story. Because you can always go back and say, five women, and I'm just I don't have all the facts of how many women, all that stuff. I'm just making an example now. But you could say like five women have already reported, and now there's other rumors. Now you can do that because there's already this looming story. But when it's just rumors that are unsubstantiated, you really can't run with it.
Well, and the other thing too, right, is reporters like anyone else want to break the story, get to it first, and our friend Alexei broke the story initially, but all these other people when they if they break the story of the next allegation or the next happening in this case, they can have their cake of well, we broke this part of the story too.
Yeah, exactly. And one other thing to make it a little bit more California centric, one of the thing I was thinking was even remember when Karen Bass, right after the fire, was caught in the terminal by that British or Australian reporter, and she looked like she was drugged, right? That's me opining. I don't know if she was drugged. I know that when she was asked questions, she couldn't answer the questions, right? But even with that, even as a reporter, having the video, you can show the video and everyone can kind of see what they see. But if you were just writing about it, what would you write and say? You couldn't say that she was on drugs because you don't really know. You couldn't say that, you can't really say anything besides she couldn't really answer questions or refuse to answer questions because that's part's true. But, in her mind, maybe she just hated the questions and the best thing that she had going for her was to just say nothing. And yeah, she's going to look stupid, but it's better than saying the wrong thing. I mean, you really just don't even know. But that's another example of, thank God for video because there's no way you could have written that in a way that would have done it justice.
That's right. So now, of course, all of this is coming in the midst of a governor's race where we got to pick somebody to be the next governor, like it or not. And you've got about 6 weeks, right, before Election Day. Voting starts in a couple of weeks. So where are we at now in the governor's race? It seems like this race has been dominated, and you and I have both written them and talked about this a lot during this campaign of there's been a lot of this political consultant and, political reporter parlor game, right? You had as Matt always will say, the Democratic data vendor, Paul Mitchell, puts out his top two algorithm to try to make the case that as Democrats need to do more to make sure that it's top, at least one Democrat makes the top two. Now we've been seeing in the hours since Swalwell's departure from the race, it seems like all the pundits now, especially the DC pundits, are trying to say, well, Tom Steyer now is the front runner and the odds-on favorite to become governor. There's other polling that says, well, no, because the second choice of all the Swalwell voters by far is Katie Porter, and she's poised to do the best. And I think really, if we learn anything from all of this, right, is that we have no idea. That voters have focused on two things in this race. Number one, Katie Porter's angry boss routine on camera that still, I would argue, has probably made her unelectable, though anything's possible at this point. And second is the Swalwell incident. I think we don't know. And I think maybe it's time to, why don't we just sit back and let the campaign play out? Let the voters weigh in. Let the voters ask questions. Let journalists actually seriously examine the statements and the background and the positions of the candidate. Matt, where do you think we're at these days? And do you think we're going to be have a campaign continue to be dominated by sort of media and political consultant parlor game?
Too many people want to look like experts on social media, and you're right, no one has any idea what's going to happen. I mean, in a non-competitive election, you can kind of tell what's going to happen, although not always. And then, a couple weeks out, campaigns can use polling and other metrics to kind of make decisions, about how they want to proceed. But so I'm not saying data is totally useless, but this wide of a field, this far out, the perceived front runner, although he was never really particularly ahead in polls. I mean, he was always sort of within the margin of error. He just fell off, but he only had like 16 points. So, I mean, that's not exactly going to push anyone over the edge either, unless one person picked up all of his support. But even that wouldn't get you to majority. So, it's really too early. As you like to point out, this is of the front runners is the least qualified isn't necessarily the right word, although it's the one that comes to mind. It's the least least qualified. They don't really have any Sacramento experience. Katie Porter, Tom Steyer, even the Republicans, Chad Bianco and Steve Hilton, none of them have any presence in Sacramento. That in itself isn't a deal breaker, but they also don't have any experience as executives. That in itself isn't a deal breaker. But as you pointed out, California has suffered from 8 years of neglect from Gavin Newsom. And at best, most problems haven't gotten any better, although some have gotten worse. So it's important for the race to become about how these people think they're going to improve the lives of Californians and whether those plans actually make sense. And what's interesting is that a lot of the lower performing candidates may not be my personal choice. But they have more experience in Sacramento. They have more executive experience. Becerra ran a large agency. Becerra was the state's attorney general. Betty Yee was the state's controller. But those are pretty relevant experience. Matt Mahan is the mayor of a large city, has a relatively successful record there. Tony Thurmond is superintendent of public instruction. Antonio Villaraigosa was, the mayor of Los Angeles and then Speaker of the Assembly. Again, some of these people may not be choices that I want to see happen, but unquestionably they all have more relevant experience than the front runners. And I don't know what that says, if this is just the candidates themselves are just total duds, or people aren't covering issues and those are people who are based in issues, or this is just more of the electorate's repulsion from expertise and experience. Everyone wants an outsider. I don't really know what that means, but again, I think it comes back to the idea that look, one of these people is going to be the next governor, and we should probably vet not only them as people, right? The Swalwell stories are very relevant information, but we also need to know how they're going to govern and or at least get some insight into how they might govern. So hopefully we start paying less attention to consultants who are paid by every Democratic campaign making wild predictions based off of their some algorithm they created that's going to tell us the future, and start paying more attention to actually what these people want to do. And it's unfair to say the media hasn't covered issues up to this point, because they have. Objectively, those stories get less attention. But look, I mean, we got to know what these people are going to do, and California can't afford another 8 years of whatever we got from Gavin Newsom, which is not much. I don't know who the right candidate is to deliver us forward, but California is in a precarious situation, and this is we always hear it, but I think it's true. This is a very important election.
Well, Matt Fleming, of course, is the right candidate to take us forward. But that aside, it makes you wonder, right? Are the debates that we have coming up, there's a CBS debate, there's a CNN debate, are those going to have outsized influence? Will people actually tune in? I don't think people really have focus on this race at all, other than those two moments of candidates behaving badly. And so I don't think you can write off or promote any of these candidates really, because, well, I don't think people are really paying attention. I think also, whatever polling you're seeing, and there's polling out even this morning, trying to show the rise of Tom Steyer. Well, I think we're too raw in the middle of it. And I think, you got to let things settle down a little bit before you can get an honest view of the race. I think there's definitely, remember, and I said this many times before, when we had a race that was, 14%, 13%, 12%, well, is anybody really a front runner in that scenario? Especially when it's within the margin of error and everybody's bunched up like that? I don't think so. And so now if we have, kind of a similar dynamic with, maybe different candidates in that, well, it's no stretch to say that a Becerra couldn't go from 5 to 12, or Betty Yee could take off. Betty Yee hasn't been looked at yet. So people writing her off, her campaign's just beginning, and it doesn't take a heck of a lot of effort and money for someone to catch fire in a week and go from 2 to 10 overnight. And so I think, there's some candidates who are less poised to ride a wave, but I think any one of these kind of major 6 to 8 candidates that we're seeing, I think any one of them could make the top 2 at this point.
I think you're right. And you asked the question, would the upcoming debates make a difference? Unless somebody has some massive, great for viewing viral moment, it's probably not going to propel anyone to no one's going to get like a 30-point bump coming out of it, probably. But with races as close as this, and again, we're talking the front runners have like 15%, right? So it's not, they're not that far ahead. You do well in a couple of debate performances, and that gives you a 1, 2, 3 point bump, something like that, and you do it a couple times. That could really add up to get you kind of right in that position there.
We'll get back to our great guest in just a moment. But first, are you following PRI on Facebook? By following PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, that's all one word, you'll be the first to read free market ideas from PRI's terrific team of scholars on all the hot issues like education freedom, single-payer healthcare, crime, homelessness, green mandates like the ban on natural gas appliances, and more. Plus, when you follow PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, you'll be the first to know when tickets go on sale for PRI's must-attend luncheons, dinners, and galas across the state. And you'll be first in line to secure your spot to hear great speakers like Michael Schellenberger, Gordon Chang, Steve Hilton, and many more. So go to facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute and follow PRI today so you'll be the first to know. So let's look as we kind of wind down our discussion. The parlor game for a lot of this winter and spring has been, will the Republicans be the top two contenders in the primary and shut out the Democrats? And we saw a major shakeup. Matt would argue this is the third moment people paid attention to in this race, which is President Trump endorsing Steve Hilton. So last weekend, in the midst of all of the Swalwell gate, we had the Republican convention in San Diego. And I think Matt and I, having been to many of these conventions past, are very glad that we did not have to attend this affair. And one of the things that they did at this convention was had votes to endorse various Republican statewide contenders. And there was a big vote. The big vote of the whole convention was, would Hilton or Chad Bianco, the Riverside sheriff, or no one get the Republican endorsement? And I don't know if it's a surprise to say this, but that the no candidate got the 60% required to get the Republican endorsement, and Chad Bianco actually beat Steve Hilton by a few points. Now, one could argue, did the president's endorsement prevent Bianco from getting the endorsement? From what I read and hear from insiders, Bianco was probably a bit of a contender to get that 60% threshold. Does it say anything about the weakness of a Hilton candidacy? I don't know. You would think with the advantages that he has in terms of money and name recognition and support of the president, well, he should be doing much better among the Republican field, and he's not. Now, just like you can't really take Betty Yee coming in second at the Democratic convention as any sign of her level of support of the public at large, it's a measurement of her support in the room, which is dominated by party activists who are generally far to the left, and a lot of loony people go to hang out at Democratic and Republican conventions. I think that's how I would view the Bianco vote. It's a statement of how he did with the party activists in the room that are much more to the right than even the Republican electorate as a whole. And yes, there are more loony people per capita that hang out and vote in those contests at the Republican convention. I don't know that it's a statement at all of where he's at in the race overall. But I think one thing is clear is that Hilton isn't putting away Bianco by any stretch of the imagination, though he is favored and ahead in the polls at this point. Matt, how do you view the convention vote and kind of where things stand on the Republican side of things?
I agree with you. By conventional metrics, Steve Hilton should be further ahead than he is right now. But Bianco has real support amongst, the party faithful. People really like him. And it reminds me of 8 years ago when Travis Allen had a lot of that, activist party support, and Trump endorsed John Cox, which ultimately got John Cox talks through the top two. I don't think people just automatically do whatever he says. He also has a history of picking who seems like the winner. And like, look, if I was guessing, I would say that Steve Hilton looks like he would probably be the winner. And winner in the primary sense, he still would. Either of them would have a difficult challenge against a Democrat in the general election. Having said that, Hilton has more endorsements. He is a stronger policy wonk. He has a bigger following. He has more money. So just by conventional metrics, I'd say he has the better shot. But again, Republicans love law and order. Bianco seems to speak to that. I could have sworn Bianco had some interactions with Trump, like positive ones back in the first term. So I'm surprised that Trump did make the endorsement. But yeah, I mean, I think you pretty much framed it right, Tim. And I don't really know who's going to get through. Them splitting support like that does create more potential for the possibility of two Republicans getting through. But I think ultimately Democratic voters are going to coalesce around one or two candidates, and that'll ultimately push them up to the top.
So finally, as we kind of wrap up our discussion today of, the TMZ episode of Next Round podcast, what are you looking for in the week ahead? What should we be watching for? Where do you think we go from here as the dust clears from the Swalwell scandal?
I think you're probably going to see more and more stories about Swalwell. And I think that I would just say look to some of the lesser known candidates starting to get a little bit more attention. I think that Steyer and Porter, while still formidable and could very well become the Democratic nominee or, the Democrat who advances into the general, I do think that they've been passed over in a lot of people's minds. And that's going to be tough for people to sort of get past. So I would say look to greater attention paid to some of the lower polling candidates. What about you, Tim?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would also look for kind of the political insiders, the interest groups, the elected officials that have egg on their face to continue, maybe even double down on their efforts to try to anoint someone in the governor's race. I think they don't want to leave it to ultimately the voters, and they want to put their stamp on this race, and don't be surprised if a Newsom starts to take a stronger role, a Pelosi weighs in, the big interests, the kind of the word about town here, right, is that Steyer and Porter both are kind of unacceptable choices for most of all of these audiences. Well, if that's the case, well, who benefits from that? Does a Becerra start to pick up? Do some of them go for Mahan? Do some go for Villaraigosa or Yee? That's what I would look for in the coming days. Where do these folks start to line up? Do they bury their head in the sand and say we don't want to get egg on our face again? I don't believe that. I think they're going to be even more aggressive in wanting to make their influence known on this race. And with that, thank you for joining us for our tabloid edition of Next Round podcast, and join us again next week for another edition of Next Round. Thank you for joining us.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.